Paisley Laigh Kirk Graveyard Tour, self-guided. Welcome to Paisley Arts Centre, formerly the Laigh Kirk. The oldest church in Paisley is the Paisley Abbey. As this had such a huge congregation, it was decided another church should be built, known as the Laigh Kirk, and it was to be built on New Street. The first foundation brick was laid on the 13th of May 1736, and the building was completed by August 1738 by masons Hart and Baird. The first minister was Rev Robert Mitchell, who is buried here. There is a description of him and his life a little further on. One very well-known minister is John Witherspoon. Reverend Witherspoon was a very strict minister. He is most famously known for moving to America and being the only clergyman to sign the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. Witherspoon hated the arts and thought theatrical plays were immoral, so we're not sure how pleased he would have been when in 1987 the building was converted to the Arts Centre. When the Paisley Centre was built, and when the Laigh Kirk was converted, some of the graves were removed and some relocated within the grounds. Some bodies were removed. The graves that look like tabletops are called mort graves, and these are likely to be in the original position and still have remains underneath them. Rev Robert Mitchell. This is Rev Robert Mitchell. He was a second minister at the Abbey. As the Abbey had such a large congregation, it had two ministers, so he moved here to the Laigh Kirk when it opened its doors in 1738. Because this was such a long time ago and people didn't keep many records, it is difficult to get a lot of information. But we know he married Kath Glassford, who died in 1781. He had a daughter called Euphemia, who was just 5 years old when Robert died in 1746. It seems Robert was a good and well-liked minister from the inscription on his grave. Some of it has worn away, but this is some of what can still be read. Burning and shining light, this place of a useful and excellent pastor, his friends and acquaintance of a safe and sweet counsellor, and his family of an admired and affectionate head. Upon 9th March 1746, when about the 50th year of his age, he fell asleep in Jesus. But his life, how laborious, his death, how victorious, his state, how glorious, no chisel can tell. And I think if you get something like that on your grave, you've done okay in life. Rev George Muir. Here is another Reverend, George Muir, who moved to Paisley in 1766 to the High Church. He married Isabel Wardlaw, the daughter of a minister, who died in 1772, aged 48. George had died a year earlier in 1771, aged 47. They had 8 children, including James, who became a minister in Virginia, George, who did not live a month, and Ebenezer. They lived in a tenement at the top of St. Mirren's Street, which was built in 1765. The property was divided into flats, with one flat containing William Gilroy, a baker, Robert Pollock, a grocer, and John Miller, a proprietor. Thomas Kibble, a writer, was in another flat, and George Muir was in the third flat. George was a popular minister, with a congregation of around 3,000. He wrote 2 books and encouraged people to worship and set up meeting places to practice their faith, which was very successful. George found a cancerous tumour on his foot, which was very painful. After some time, he had an amputation, and recovery seemed promising. However, one night when he was sleeping, an artery in his leg burst. He awoke and discovered it, fainted, and never recovered. This took place on the morning of the Sabbath, and being unexpected, created great sadness among his people. Erected in the memory of Reverend George Muir, D.D., minister in Paisley. He was a faithful minister, loving husband, an affectionate parent, and an agreeable companion. Beloved while he lived, and at his death left in the minds of his family, of his friends, and of his flock. A monument which time cannot destroy. He died the 21st of July, 1771, aged 47. Here is also interred the remains of Isabel Wardlaw, his spouse, who died the 2nd of July, 1772, aged 48. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance. William Carlisle. Buried here is a provost of Paisley, William Carlisle, a hugely religious man and also part of a political party called the Whigs. William helped to start up the first newspaper in Paisley. The first meeting was held at the Saracen Head Inn, and the Paisley Advertiser was first published 9th of October 1824. William also wrote an autobiography which gives some detail into his life, but very much focuses on his faith and religion. John Carlisle, merchant, died 1st of October 1773, aged 76. Question either a 0 or a 6. Janet Birkmeyer, his spouse, died June 2nd, 1803, aged 81. They, with 7 of their children and 10 grandchildren, were buried in this place. Blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. Mrs. Janet Birkmeyer, spouse to William Carlisle, Esquire, died 7th May 1826, aged 75. William Carlisle, Esquire, and late Provost of Paisley, died 20th October 1829, in his 83rd year. Also died on 3rd October 1828, Agnes Irving, wife of Warren Carlisle, manufacturer in Paisley. Died on 5th October 1829, Agnes, their infant daughter. James Carlisle died 28th October 1833, aged 83 years. John Niven. This is John Niven. He was a maltman and is the first person to have been buried here at the Laigh Kirk. He bought the plot in 1740 for 13 shillings. The Stevensons. The Stevensons were a very important family in Paisley, and were a very versatile family, from alkaline works to one family member owning a volcano and leaving the equivalent of £26 million when he died. But it is James Stevenson who is buried here. James was a silk manufacturer in Paisley. In 1760, George II died, and the silk industry took off as people went into mourning and silk was in demand. In 1766, James married Janet Niven, daughter of John Niven, in the grave mentioned just a few moments ago. They lived in the upstairs of a house on High Street. Downstairs was an office where shelves of silk yarn would be distributed to freelance weavers who had looms at home. They would bring back the finished silk fabric and be paid between 10 and 25 shillings, depending on the quality and speed. The work was put on show for garment manufacturers to buy. In 1773, as competition sharpened, the silk masters cut the wages for the weavers, and the weavers formed a trade union. Stevenson's house in High Street was besieged by pickets for 2 months, every day except Sunday. No thread was going out, and no fabric was coming back for him to sell. The workers on the picket threatened anyone coming near the office. James tried to sneak some thread to one woman, only for her to be caught by the weavers on the picket line. She was marched back to the office to return the thread. Janet, James's wife, had been married once before but widowed by the time she was 26. She met and married James and they had 7 children, although 4 died in infancy. Janet died aged 39 on 18th of November 1779 and was buried here next to her 4 babies. James's next wife was Margaret Cochrane. She was the daughter of John Cochrane, an influential townsman, one of 3 magistrates, and the town treasurer. They lived on New Street, just next to the Laigh Kirk. John Cochrane was a bad-tempered fellow, and although Margaret had little education, she was good at controlling tempers and had a lot of common sense. Margaret and James Stevenson married in 1780, a year after Janet had died. They had 9 children. 3 died in infancy. In total, James had 16 children with 2 wives, although only 9 reached adulthood. In 1790, the silk industry began to falter, and cotton trade took over. In 1792, Stevenson's company was in financial trouble. 9th of February 1792. Margaret's mother was sitting by the fire when her dress caught alight. Her father, John, tried to save her and put the flames out, but couldn't, and she died. It is recorded that at her funeral, John's hands were bandaged up to treat the burns he had received whilst trying to put out the flames. Margaret and James moved to Glasgow with some of their younger children, and they lived in Candleriggs in 1804. James had become listless and suffered with depression after the failure of his business, but Margaret pushed on, bringing up the children and mostly trying to marry them off. James died 24th of February 1806 and was buried here with his first wife, Janet, and their children. Erected by James Stevenson, silk manufacturer in Paisley, in memory of Janet Niven, his wife, who died 18th November 1779, aged 39, this is unclear on the grave, years, and James, Janet, John, and James, their children, who died young. Here also repose the remains of James Stevenson, who died in Glasgow 24th Feb 1806, aged 67 years, John, their son, who died 15th May 1826, this is unclear on the grave, aged 18 years, Mary, who died 3rd of Jan 1849, aged 76, and of Jane, their eldest, who died 18th, this is unclear, March 1862, aged 94 years. As for Margaret, she did okay, despite having a bad-tempered father, a depressed husband, and a mother who suffered a horrible death. She inherited some money, and the children did quite well for themselves. She died 23rd February 1827, aged 73, and was buried at Glasgow Cathedral. We hope you've enjoyed the guided tour of the Arts Centre grounds. If you have any information about any of the families We would love to hear about them. Thank you.